So the early church, like before the creeds were formed, which is roughly the first 300 or so years of the church's existence, grew because of one primary thing. And it wasn't theology, and it wasn't scholarship, as much as that hurts me, and it wasn't correct doctrine, and it wasn't charismatic preachers, and it wasn't even miracles or the gifts of the Spirit, and I'm sorry, Pentecostals, it wasn't even tongues. Those things happened, but that's not why the church grew and was successful, and what they really stood on was the resurrection. Okay? And the idea of, I'm not preaching on this today, but I just felt like we sang that song, I'm no longer a slave to fear. And most people take that song to mean I don't need to fear God. But the idea of the incarnation is about no more fear of death. Right? Because the incarnation culminated in death. It always does. When we're born, we're like just another step closer to death. For every day. And so that's the eventual goal of all, not goal, but end point of all life, and what was so terror-inspiring in people. And so Paul says that he came that we should have freedom from the bondage of fear of death, right? So the resurrection was an event that happened in history that we don't need to, even though I do, we don't need to trust the Bible on the resurrection. Okay, because we actually trust even just as much the fact that for 300 years people had absolutely no fear of death. None whatsoever. They willingly went to be martyred. Why? You don't do that on a theory. You don't watch your children be burned alive for a myth. Okay? And then things happened, and then the church got in bed with empire, and Constantine said, "Come with me, I will give you governmental protection." Oh, that was a good move. And then a bunch of stuff happened, and there was this great schism, and then there was the Catholic Church, and then once again the church got into bed with empire. And the Roman Empire said, "Oh, let us give you protection." And then things went along, and then there was a Protestant Reformation, and then a bunch of those people came to America, and then, surprise, 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 they climbed in bed with empire. And the government of the United States is saying, "We will give you protection." Guess what happens whenever this happens in history? I'm not talking religiously or prophetically. I'm talking as a historian. Guess what happens? Things change. You know, strict legalism, which is endorsement of religion by legal means, always precedes revolution in the religion. This happened in Buddhism, this happened in Islam, this happened in Hinduism, this has happened in Judaism, and that's what makes up most of our Bible. Is the Reformation that was born out of the strict legalism that was happening in the religion. So when you look at things a little more openly, it's actually, we're seeing it happen again. Okay, and so we don't need to what's going on? Quit trying to save Christianity. It's fine. Okay, on the one hand, Christianity will never go away. On the other hand, the parts that are dying off need to. You know, you don't keep a gangrenous limb alive. Sorry, it's got to go. And that might be rough, and look, things are changing. You know, the church in America is changing. The format that we have here is no longer acceptable to the majority of people. You know, as much as we have a good particular fellowship, this format of stage and monologue and audience and all that no longer has validity for the majority of people. Millennials don't like it. Hence, none. You know, I'm not even a millennial, I'm a Gen X, so I'm older than them, but you know, so things are changing, and this is, when you study history, you get a little bit more comfortable with the changes that are happening, because you realize, it's not catastrophic. You know, we don't need to fret what will happen with the church corporate or with our church individually. You know, whatever happens, happens, and if God is in it, resurrection always happens after death. Okay? So if something dies, awesome. You know, and because of the way that we believe, our God is a God of resurrection, and that's that. You know, so with the American church, I'm gonna be prophetic now and say the fact that both sides of the political aisle have Christians who are dogmatic about their political stance means that there is portion of the Christian faith in America that has climbed in bed with empire. And it doesn't matter, this is not a one-sided or the other political thing. This is what happens. And so the strict legalism is on its way. Be ready for that. However, yeah, it's here in many ways, but it's, and like I said, this happened in Buddhism too. China tried to enforce Buddhism throughout the land long, long time ago, and then Reformation happened within Buddhism too, and it's just human nature. We think we need to control. And this is why I think the Bible, great segue, is so adamantly against domination and control. Okay? When we look through a lot of the things that we think the Bible is saying, what we actually find under that, like especially when it's laws against certain actions and activities, what we find underneath all that is the Bible is forbidding domination. Okay, in various areas and however that plays out. And so if you're still here, if we're still here by the time we get to Leviticus, reading through the Bible the way that we've been doing, then we'll talk about some of those prohibitions. And just as a little teaser, I'm writing an essay for the church blog right now on homosexuality in the Bible and how the Bible doesn't say what we think it says, and it's going to be on our blog, and it's very, very long. And so if you go to read it, take your time. And it's time for some of this stuff to just politely go away, okay? Anyways, now I can talk about Genesis. So it's been a little bit since I talked, and me and Dad had a conversation, and I'm going to be trying to teach once a month to kind of keep things a little more in your mind. And my whole goal is to read through the Bible with you. That really is it, okay? Sometimes along the way, I say things that might confuse you. Feel free to go, hold on, okay? Or if I throw out a term that comes from one of my nerd books, you can go, define that term, or if you have a cell phone, you can just look it up on Google. But essentially, Genesis 1 to 11 is what, for those who paid attention? What is it? Oh, come on. It's the flood story. It's not creation. It's not the fall. It's not the story of why homosexuality is wrong and heterosexuality is normal. That's not what's going on in Genesis 1 through 11. Okay? Genesis 1 through 11 is the flood story. And if you picked up a fictional book today, I'm not saying that Genesis 1 to 11 is fiction, but let's just pretend for a minute. So let's say, how many of you know the Chronicles of Narnia books? And how many of you know that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is not the first book in the series? That's the one we all know because that's the one the movie was made about, but there's a book before that. And the book before that is called The Magician. Good job. See, Nancy knows it. And The Magician sets up the whole world of Narnia. Like everything about Narnia is set up in The Magician. But there's no movie about The Magician because it's boring. Okay? I mean, from the standpoint of what will sell in Hollywood. Okay? So, just like that, the ancient world knew of a massive flood. And so, every culture that was affected by this flood told their story of why this flood happened and what was accomplished in the flood. Because this is how things worked for them, right? Nothing happened that didn't have a reason behind it. If a lightning bolt struck a tree in the middle of the desert, that was the deity saying, I hate this tree in particular. Okay? It wasn't just that it's on a flat plain and of course it's a lightning rod. It's going to get struck. Pre-scientific people have a pre-scientific view of things. And just like we're scientific and need to know the reason why, so did they. And they didn't have repeatable experiments they could do to show that, oh no, gravity is a thing that makes things fall to the ground. It's not God hurling you down. Okay? So all of that needs to be kept in mind when we're reading, especially the very ancient parts of the Bible. Some parts are newer than others. The Hebrew Bible alone traverses like 2,000 years. That's a long time. And we think about, like, because the Bible is living to us, we read it as though this happened a few hundred years ago. I mean, this is thousands of years in human history before all kinds of inventions that we take for granted now. Okay? So these are things that are important. So with Genesis 1 to 11, then what we have is Israel's particular explanation or explanations of why the flood took place. Okay? And in that, you have to have, well, how did the world even get here to be flooded in the first place? Okay, well, let's cover that ground real quick. Here's our magician. He's setting up the world. And then within that, you see some hints toward the flood, right? Because Cain kills Abel. Well, why did Cain kill Abel? Because there was a fall. So you kind of have to trace yourself backwards. So if you want, you could start at the flood, and you could say, okay, there was a flood. Why was there a flood? There was a flood because of violence. Because the world was consumed with violence. Not just because there was like a little bit of fighting here and there, but the earth was totally consumed with violence. This is what the Bible says. Why was the earth consumed with violence? Well, because there was this guy who killed his brother, and then God protected him. And so everyone thought, well, I can just kill who I want, and God will protect me. And apparently he did, because the earth was consumed with violence. But how did this guy get here? Well, you see in the beginning, so you see how you can trace that back, and you can see this is the flood story. And so all of these stories are little blocks and chunks of theological tradition, okay? Or I like to call it tribal tradition, because that really sets the stage for what's going on. Israel is not a nation. They are not a people. They are a group of tribes. And early in their history, they are more like tribal federations kind of scattered about, who all have their own traditions. And what I tend to think, and there are some scholars who are going to agree with this and some who are going to disagree, but is that the Hebrew people, the Aparu people that the Egyptians said they had wiped off the earth and all this, and is a particular group of outcasts from among all these tribes. Okay, does that make sense? So they're people who were thrown down the mountain, basically, into the land below. And this is where God, in the Bible, has chosen to reveal himself among the slaves and outcasts of tribes of long ago. Okay? And so these tribes all have different ways of talking about God, about their deity. And if we grew up in the charismatic movement, we had banners all around our room, and the El Shaddai and Jehovah Nissi, and I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but Jehovah isn't even a word. That's someone who didn't know how to read Hebrew writing it, and they wrote it incorrectly, and so what we do with things that have the word Jehovah in them, you can just go, those are deities. El Shaddai was a deity of Canaan. Okay, El is the supreme deity of Canaan, and God is called El. El Elyon is God Most High. He's another deity. And we see these, in our English Bible, you'll just see the Lord my rock, the Lord my protector. Well, then there's all these epithets of Yahweh. The Lord of hosts, as they call him, but that's Yahweh Sabaoth. That's a name. Okay, so these are tribal, I like to call them tribal revelations of God, that the stories have made their way into the text. They get woven together because they're not going to throw them out. At the point that they're assembling these texts, they are a group of people, but they come from tribes. And these tribes are outlined for us later on in the Bible. We know all of them, or should. Dan and Asher and Gad and Reuben and Levi, and this is, and Ephraim and Manasseh, and these are the tribes of Israel, okay? So in these tribes, you have all of these stories, and some scholars like to say, oh, that means that there is what they call a documentary approach to the Pentateuch, especially the Old Testament, the idea that there were separate sources that they used and just kind of stitched them together to tell their stories. I don't particularly follow that model exactly, other than it's pretty easy to recognize that there are chunks of literature as you move along. Like I said, the flood story is comprised of 2 creation narratives, a fall story, a murder scene, and then a genealogy out of nowhere that leads up to the hero of the flood. Okay, so now in the connection of all these little groups of stuff that get connected together, we've talked about this, and these are the generations of. That usually is a stitch. Okay, and what they're doing in Genesis 1 to 11, and we'll get to 12 here in a minute. We'll get to 12. They're putting together, okay, here's a story that we have, here's another story that we have, here's another story that we have. How do we get from this guy to this guy? Oh, I have a toledote. And it's the generations of Adam to Noah. That goes in between Adam and Noah. Well, that makes sense, right? And then after the flood, there's another generation list. And that leads you from Noah to Abraham. Okay, and so this is what they do when they're layering their stories together. They're always going to stitch them together with these generation lists. Usually, again, anything in the scholarly world, ask a dozen scholars, you're going to get 24 answers. Okay, some of them disagree with themselves at times. So it's okay to have a varying opinion here, but usually they say this is the hand of a priestly editor later in the life of the text. That doesn't mean the stories are new. It means that the stories are probably very old and put together with a generation list. Just meant to kind of, okay, let's get this as literature now. So we have Genesis 1 to 11 comprised of several stories that tell the story of the flood in the ancient world. And in that we find out that the deity does it, God does it, if we want to say it religiously, because the world is full of violence and it's the last resort of the deity. Okay? He doesn't do it because I kind of messed up. I don't really like their ears. For some reason, they just never stop growing. And so he wipes out the world because our ears don't stop growing. No, our ears still never stop growing. No, it's he sees what's going on in the world and he is distressed. And he says, I don't know what to do here. And a lot of us can't handle the words, I don't know, coming from God. And he says, I guess what I have to do is destroy the world. But I'm not going to utterly destroy it. I'm going to save 2 of everything because that's how reproduction happens. Okay, so it's this idea of a deity who does this as a last resort, but built into his last resort is the renewal of all things again. Okay, so if you want to take your vision of hell and you want to stack it up to the flood story, and you say, well, I still believe in eternal conscious torment. And I can say, that's fine. The Bible never says anything about that. But if you want to believe that, stack it up to the Noah story, and you have to understand that anything the deity does, he does for an end of restoration and making all things new. Okay? And so even in our visions of hell, and we'll get there in about 6 years when I get to the New Testament, because it takes the New Testament to talk about hell. You don't find it in the Old Testament. Even in our visions of that, though, we have to overlay that into what the Bible actually is saying. And this is how we should be doing theology. What we have been doing as theology is, I think, I don't care what you think, and no, I'm not a biblicist or a literalist on the one hand, but on the other hand, I like to be one. Because if you really, really, really want things to be literal, it's not going to make sense. And so I like to show that, and to say, let's read it literately, is what Marcus Borg said. Instead of reading it literally, let's read it literately. And to the point of when I say something like, hey, archaeology has proven that the Battle of Ai and Joshua never happened. That doesn't need a response of, so you're saying archaeology is right and the Bible's wrong? No, what I'm saying is that whenever we come across something like that, it needs to reorient us on how we're approaching that text. If the text is proven false historically, it's not trying to do history. They don't lie intentionally, okay? They're doing something else. In the case of Joshua, it's theological polemic with Canaan. We'll get there later. But this happens. There are things that the Bible talks about that we can either verify never happened we can say are highly unlikely to have happened, or we can say there's just no evidence to either. Yeah, and for those things, I usually say, okay, let's trust what it's saying until we learn otherwise. There are some things, and we'll touch on this today, there are some things that just, from a time standpoint, just don't work, and so need to be later additions and things like that. But that's kind of it. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes here. There's a guy named Nahum Sarna, and he's a Jewish commentator on the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible stuff. He's a rabbi, I believe. And he has a commentary on Genesis that's wonderful. And he says that and he says this without reservation, all scholars of Genesis subscribe to a non-unitary approach. That is, they postulate the one-time existence of various blocks and collections of traditions that were eventually combined into a single work. So that's just, everybody knows this, except the church for some reason. And so this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, is because I think, the church has had the wool pulled over their eyes for far too long by people who could say things and you couldn't verify. But now you all have smart devices, and you can verify what's being said. And you don't have to be a Greek or Hebrew scholar to say, okay, well, in this particular verse, he said this word means this. And there are websites where you can go and click it, and you can see the definition and say, well, hey, he's right, or no, well, that doesn't seem right. And this is not hard. So then, using Sarna's terminology, the larger collection that we have covered so far is Genesis 1 to 11. Within that collection, there are smaller blocks of stories and tradition. And if any of you ever read commentaries at all, Old Testament scholars will call early parts of Genesis myth, but they don't mean fiction. Myth in the scholarly academic world just means story. Okay, and it prevents them from being roped into arguments of history, because myth is not history. It's not meant to be. It tells historical things, but it's not scientific history the way that we would write it today. So one way that they have stitched these things together is the Toledot, which is what these are the generations of. When you see that, ele Toledot, that's what it means. That particular piece is almost always recognized as some kind of a stitch, a later insertion, something to put the pieces together. Okay? And then I have a quote here from a different guy named David Noel Freeman. He said, each writer or editor was, in varying degrees, a receiver, a transmitter, and a contributor of these texts. Okay? So they take the story, and the story doesn't leave them necessarily in the same way it entered. And that happens with us too. I can guarantee you that we could probably all quote John 3:16 in the same translation even. If we did it, but if I were to say who knows John 3:17 or John 3:15, maybe my dad. And so what we've done, we've kind of memorized verses without realizing that that's saying, well, what's your favorite Harry Potter verse? Oh, Harry climbed on the train. And then, well, that's the end of the verse. What do you do before that? I don't know. The verse starts with, and Harry climbed on the train. And that's my favorite verse in the Harry Potter series. Which book is it from? I don't know. That happens several times in multiple books. So it's, this is what we've done with the Bible. Leonard Sweet says we have versitis. And we don't know the Bible as the stories that make it up. We know it as the verses that we've added to it. There are no verses in the original texts. There are also no vowels in the Hebrew stuff. That's not important until it is. And then there are points where that gets real important. And there are times where things have been changed in an explicitly anti-Christian bias in the Hebrew Old Testament, because those vowels weren't added till the Middle Ages. It's not much, but there are some times. And there are some times where Paul uses the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible and formulates a doctrine out of something that actually isn't there because the Greek translator made a mistake. I just wrote about this on our church blog, right? In Romans, I'm not even on my notes yet. We'll get there. We'll get there, folks. In Romans, Paul talks about bitterness, and he quotes the Psalms, and he's like, oh, their mouth is full of bitterness. And so we've had this doctrine in the church that if you're bitter, you just need to pull yourself up and get over it. Just move on from the death of your child. Don't be bitter. Just move on from that sexual abuse. Don't be bitter. What utter crap. And what utter crap compared to what Paul did there. Paul created a doctrine out of something that doesn't exist in the psalm. The psalmist says their mouths are full of deceit. And it's about domination again. And what happens is the word deceit is mirma in Hebrew. M-R, first two consonants, no vowels, right? The word for bitter is M-R-R. So the translator made a mistake there, put bitter in there when they put it in Greek, and Paul brings it over as a doctrine. Which text is inerrant? Is it the original Hebrew? Is it the Greek translator that made a mistake, or is it Paul that turned it into a doctrine? Okay, and that's not the only time that happens. Okay, so when we get into this and we start talking about, oh, well, I believe it's inerrant, let's be careful. Because I believe in inspiration. I believe that God inspired the scriptures to be written. Okay, by people. But these people did not live in a vacuum, they did not write in a vacuum, they did not worship in a vacuum. Because it's very small in there. No. You got it. They lived, they wrote, and they worshiped from within their own particular culture. And their culture was influenced by other cultures. And sometimes what they're writing is in the face of other cultures. And they're not meaning to write doctrine for people 5,000 years later. You know, they're meaning to confront a very real theology in their time. Many times, a very real theology for them that has been lost for us for thousands of years. Things that we no longer even know about, much less believe. Did you know that Yahweh has a wife in Canaanite mythology? And did you know that her name is Asherah? And did you know that the way that they worshipped Asherah was to carve male images, which is a penis, an Asherah pole? And so why do you think the Bible is so adamantly against the worship of Asherah poles? Because Yahweh doesn't have a wife in Judaism. That's problematic for what happens in the theology in Judaism. And number two, it kind of gives us an image of what happens as they engage the other culture. Okay, they give life to a thing that we don't even know. And then we say, Asherah it's a kind of pole. No, it's not. It was another deity. And she was married to the god that the Israelites call theirs in other mythologies. So let's be careful. I'm going to skip over some things here because we've already talked about that. So having said all that, we actually know that from a very, very early time, Genesis is a complete unit. Meaning, even though we know that it's a collection of stories, they were stitched together a long time ago. Okay? And there are scholars who want to say, oh, they didn't even write this until after the exile, and that's demonstrably false. There are things in these stories that are very, very ancient, and ways of talking that are very ancient, okay, and literary motifs that are very ancient. And so it helps us to understand that they are collections of even more ancienter stories, and that somewhere along the way a priest put them together, because that helps us understand that we are not reading scientific history, okay? We're reading various attempts at origin. Where have we come from? People throughout history have tried to answer this question in various ways. Okay, I mean, the origin of species, that was his question. Where have we come from? Right? So, nothing new. So then, let's start with let's go ahead and start with 11:27 because I want to go from there through 12, and we'll be done by like 1:30. Well, I'm going to teach you all Hebrew this morning. No, I'm just kidding. And I'm just going to read whatever's on the screen instead of trying to get my Bible open. And so what happens in 1 to 11, right? We have creation, we have a fall, we have a murder, we have the earth being consumed with violence, we have a flood because of this violence, and then we have a table of nations. And the table of nations tells us what the flood area was because that's their known world. So when they say the world was flooded, you say, okay, here's the table of nations, and you go map those geographically, and you can see where the earth was flooded. And it doesn't mean globe because they had no concept of a globe. Okay? So imagine you're at the latest Avengers Marvel movie. Man, this might be the wrong audience to talk about comic book movies. So let's talk about some other movie that you've been to. And how many of you are the kind of people that when you go to a movie, you'll stay till after the credits? Because like sometimes Nathan, what do they do sometimes? Ooh, there's an Easter egg. What a good word for what we're talking about in the season of Lent. Well done, Nathan. There's an Easter egg. It's almost like a preview for something that they're going to be releasing soon, or a bonus, right? Or something in that realm. In the Simpsons movie, there's like Maggie who never speaks, and she's the baby, and she comes out after the credits roll, and she says sequel. And so, but it's after the credits, right? So in the Bible, this is done too, and it's the Tower of Babel. It's like, hey, the earth was destroyed because of violence and because people kept getting together and causing war and killing each other. And then there's this flood, and God says, now there's no more violence. There we go. And then how he kept the lions from being violent with the sheep, I don't know. And that would make for an interesting, how did they forage when they first got off the ark? Like all the carnivores? I mean, there's limited animals left for them to eat. Okay, so we can tell what they're actually doing here is not history. But after this, it's like, okay, there. The world has been washed. Roll the credits. And they roll the credits, and it's the table of nations, and then it's the generations of Noah to Abraham, and then the Tower of Babel. And it's like, oh no. And this tower is a tower of military might, and it symbolizes more violence on the way. And so it's like ... This is what is meant to happen with this story. It's meant to bring you to this place where it's like, he destroyed the world for violence, and we're doing it again, but he's bound because he said he'll never destroy it again. Yeah. And so Israel has painted this picture of a deity who does this as a last resort, who doesn't need the sacrifice when Noah gets off the ark. If you were here for Daniel, you got that when he taught. The other gods from the other flood stories swarm the sacrifice immediately because they're starving. They haven't eaten since humans went on the boat some 40 days ago. No, but this guy smells it. He's like, that smells good, thank you. And that's it. I mean, he doesn't need the sacrifice. He doesn't even want it, doesn't ask for it. Just he receives it. Oh, you're giving me a gift. How cute. Okay. That's the dad who takes the son's picture of him that looks nothing like him. Oh, did you draw an elephant? No, it's you. Okay. I love it. Let's put it on the fridge. And that's God with the sacrifice after the flood. Oh, I love it. Let's put it on the fridge. Okay? And then he swears. He says, never again for the sin of one thing will I destroy all others. Oh, there's a part we don't preach in our churches. God's going to destroy America because bull. You haven't even read through Genesis 11 yet. But you know what? Most of us haven't either, and we don't realize that this stuff is in there because we're so concerned with, did it happen? Get yourself out of that mindset. Did God really say, and did it happen, are not the places we start Christian discussions of the Bible. Did God really say should be a big one for us? We should know that we shouldn't be saying that. No, it's a fine question to ask. But at the end of it, you're never going to know. These are thousands of years old. Did God really say? Don't know. They didn't have tape recorders. Would it throw us all off if his voice was like, so don't do this. And he wasn't like big and booming, speaking to Moses, speaking on the mic. He's like, look, I can't show you my face. So then we're here at Genesis 11:27. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And they throw Lot in here for a reason. Why? Because they're foreshadowing what's going to happen later. Otherwise, why? He has no bearing on the story of Abram otherwise. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now here's a problem, because Ur of the Chaldeans was not a thing yet. So in this time, this is not a thing yet. The Chaldeans are not around yet. So this is a strange statement. It might have said originally something like, in his native land of Ur. And a later editor said, oh, I know where that is. It's in the land of the Chaldeans. Well, not really. It's actually further south than that. So just some little things along the way that we find out if we study some history. And like I said, this isn't important. Does this change your doctrine much or your salvation? No, but it's there. Okay, let's keep going. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. Now, aren't they first cousins? Yeah. So Abram and Sarah are first cousins, and that's illegal according to Leviticus. So we'll need to kind of check how we render Leviticus later. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. Now this is where scholars know, because you can't get to Haran going from Ur of the Chaldeans to the land of Canaan. It's not on the way. It's out of the way. So this is a different Ur that they're talking about. Okay, we can keep going. So in the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now we're in Genesis 12. Woohoo, we have finally made it. Okay, now officially, do you know where we are? It's a big point. We're in the patriarchal history. Okay, before we were in the prehistory, or the story of the deluge, or the flood story, or, that is the time of unknowns for ancient Israel. They don't know, and they readily admit it. All these stories of 1 to 11 are meant to be stories. But we've come now to a time of the patriarchs. And the patriarchal history is intended to be more known. Okay? So now the Lord had said to Abram. Now, Sarna notes how abrupt this is. It's like you have this guy's birth that comes from a generation list that's been inserted. So if you go from the beginning of that generation list, you take it out, you go the end of the flood story to here, it's like, all this happened, now the Lord said to Abram. So they have to fill that somehow. So how do they fill it? With the generation list. There we go, that's neat and tidy. So God bursts on the scene at a time when Abraham is presumably old enough to leave his father's house, right? So he's not just a kid. So a lot of time has passed. We've talked about this before. This is telescoping. They do this, right? We're going to jump over 50 years and talk to you about what's going on right now. So we have no idea how Abram grew up. We know that he worshipped many gods, okay? We know that the people of this time often used hallucinogenics, various drugs, to meet their deities. We know that things like opium and marijuana were prevalent back then and in this area of the world. And so, this is a culture that they encounter their deities a lot of times hallucinating or very, very high. And then all of a sudden, the Lord says to Abram, can you imagine what that would do to you if you had just eaten some mushrooms? And you're trying to experience these deities, and all of a sudden you hear, get out of your country. Sir, did you hear that? Is that just me? No, I'm not saying that Abraham was high. It was a joke. I'm sorry. Okay. But he could have been. People do that. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. Do you understand what kind of a command this is in the ancient world? Go live without protection alone for a while. And doesn't even give him a place either. He's like, leave. Where am I going? Leave. Okay, keep going. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Oh, okay. Like, so I have to leave. I don't know why. I don't know where I'm going, but I do know that you're going to bless me and make my name great. Abraham obviously doesn't have a Bible because he would know the precedent for how God makes people's names great. Yeah. He does things to them. To your descendants I will give this land, and there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And again, Deuteronomy later is going to forbid the building of altars, the way that Abraham builds this one. So patriarchs kind of get off because they don't know God yet. They're meeting God. So all of those requirements that God has, they're built into him. But for some reason, for like 1,000 years, he doesn't tell people about them. Okay. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent. Got to be careful on that line after that one viral video. With Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And actually what you're going to find here is, there he built an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of Yahweh. Okay? So, specific name there. So Abram journeyed, going still toward the south, and that's a bad translation because the Negev could be south, but the Negev is a geographic place, and it's a desert. Okay? So he just headed toward a desert because God said something in the middle of the day, apparently. Leave your dad's house, go out without protection into a place with lions and bears and Philistines and people that will rape your family and kill them and Egyptians. And trust me, you'll be fine. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now this is something that probably actually happened. Probably was legitimately a great famine at this time, because it doesn't take much. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, indeed I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. That's a good thing for a man to say to his wife. Honey, you're as homely as a mud fence, but look. No. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. Now here, it's easy to think this dude is a wimp, and he is just preserving his own, his own, saving his own skin, and sacrificing his first cousin wife. But here's the thing. Let's do a little thought experiment for a second, and let's say that Abraham, not at this time, Abram, comes into Egypt with this smoking hot wife, and he says, and they say, is this your wife? And he says, yes, she's my wife. And they say, oh, good, and they cut his head off, and they take her, and they proceed to repeatedly rape her, over and over and over and over and over and over and over. He's dead. He can't do a thing. But if he says, this is my sister, ancient Near Eastern law dictates that nobody can touch her without her brother's approval. So he's actually protecting her. Okay, I know it's easy in our frame of mind to think, what a jerk. That's because they didn't have police back then who would stop the raping. Okay? She would have been an object of scorn for the rest of her life. So he saves her. He actually does something noble. He says, you know what? I love you and I think you're beautiful, but I am willing to endure what might happen as your brother versus letting you endure what might happen if I'm your husband. Okay, so it's easy to gloss over this kind of stuff, and we'll do it again when we get to Hagar, because everybody wants to make, this is bad. Like, ancient Near Eastern customs were different, and it's okay that they lived by their customs. In fact, it would be wrong of us to expect them to live by ours. Okay, so let's keep going. So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. Oh, he was right. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. So look, they came and got her, just like he said. And not only did they come and get her, but it was Pharaoh. Oh my goodness, he was right. They would have lopped his head off, left him bleeding in the desert, and taken her to Pharaoh. And she would have been a part of his slave harem, living out her days as a sex slave, because Abraham followed model of propriety that we set up. Good for him. Okay. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. And right here is where we have an issue. Camels were not domesticated yet. The domestication of camels doesn't happen for like another 1,500 years. Okay, so what we know from this is that either A, this is a story that has been, like all other stories, kind of edited along the way. And at a time when camels were a particular sign of affluence, they were added to the list of things that are given to Abraham to make him rich. Okay, again, this isn't a big doctrinal thing, right? But it does show an editorial hand in the text, making it alive for each generation. And this is what we need to be doing too, right? If we want to put the Abraham story in modern terms, we would say he had a big house and a pool, and he drove a Bentley, and he had a Land Rover to go fishing in. And of course, only fly fishing, because if you're wealthy, that's what you do. We would put it in modern terms. Okay, Jesus does the same thing. They're called parables. So he has all this stuff, and it's important to note male donkeys versus female donkeys, and that'll happen later. Because... And I don't remember the divide between them, but why they talk about male versus female donkeys is actually important, but not important for right now. So let's keep going. Oh, yeah, we're in 17 now. So, but the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Now, here's a little more foreshadowing. God plagues Pharaoh. They're setting stuff up here. And it's just like the flood story, right? Everything works backward from the event that we all know is in our head. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way." So, just has a change of heart suddenly, right? So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Yeah, and Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and in gold, and I think we're going to go maybe through... Well, we can just leave that for now and stop there. Because, doggone it. No, we can't. Sorry. Forgive this technical interruption. When you're reliant on technology and something crashes. Okay, there. Yeah, so we don't need to do 13. Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that. Okay, but this Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him and then sent him and his wife away and all that was with him away. So again, what we're doing is we're building into the story the justification for why Abraham is so rich later on and needs to separate from his nephew Lot. But if he has to separate from Lot, then we need to know where Lot came from. And so Lot is put into the story a couple times just kind of like randomly. Oh, and by the way, also he had this nephew named Lot. Did he have other nieces and nephews? Is there anyone else in the family? Okay, so it's just these two. And that's important because it's telling us what's on the way. Okay? Yeah, I don't want to go any further into Genesis 13, so. So, something that we find in all of this is this interplay with Egypt. And you would think that knowing what we know is on the way in the next book, that they would kind of set up the Egyptians as bad people. But they don't. Okay? And so this is another reason why Sarna says, this is an early text. Because if this has come around after slavery in Egypt, they're not going to talk too nicely about Egypt. They're not going to say, Pharaoh was an honorable dude. God came to him and said, hey, don't do that. She's someone's wife. And he was like, oh, I'm an Egyptian. I'm subject to your law. Like, it has a Pharaoh obeying the voice of God. That's not in line with what happens in the next book in the Bible. Okay? So it's evidence of early authorship, like early stories. And so, again, this is something where there's a particular scholar that says, oh, none of those people ever existed, and I tend to think that she's a little bit dumb. Because you just can't know. And so what I choose to say is, well, since most of the modern world knows the stories of Abraham from various religious texts, we can go ahead and say yes, and then start talking about what happens in his story. Okay, and this is my whole point in what I'm doing, is that we have formed all these little theologies, and a lot of them really aren't even that good, around how we feel God is, should be, whatever. And we have never once taken those theologies to the Bible and said, okay, oops, this verse is an affront to that theology. I need to adjust this. What we usually do is we say, oops, that word is an affront to my theology. I need to redefine this. And that's problematic because it erases the stories that are happening. We don't get to put Frodo on the eagle and send him to Mordor at the beginning of the movie, no matter how much we want to. That's not a part of the story. Right? That's like a 2-page book. Come on. Tolkien can do way better than that. No, I mean, and all the nerds are going to debate like, well, they couldn't have because they would have seen him coming and they would have taken him out. And it's like, good for you guys. Again, not the point. That's theology, though. The theology is the little pieces of fan fiction we write about the actual story. And the actual story hasn't changed. It's uncomfortable. It says God wiped out the earth. And we're like, well, but wiped doesn't mean really like wiped out. It means like, he kind of cleansed. No, it doesn't. It says that he wiped out the earth. I'm not comfortable with that. I have particular beliefs about God that don't jive with that. But the text says what it says. So let it say what it says, and let's find out what it's actually saying. And again, like I said, the point there has to do with how God reacts towards sacrifice. And this is them working out their ancient ideas of sacrifice. Well, our God doesn't swarm it because he's not served by human hands as though he needed anything. Okay, it's a theological statement wrapped in a story. And every story has a metaphor that's attached to it, and these metaphors have different meanings, and they have varying meanings. There is no meaning to the flood story, there are meanings. Okay, and these interpretations have been going on for thousands of years. And only in recent years did we say, oh, well, God wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah because of the gays. I mean, that's very, very recent that people believe that. The ancient interpreter of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, his name was Ezekiel, and he made his way into your Bible, and he says, oh, well, they were destroyed because they were affluent and lazy and didn't want to help out poor people. Oh, and they raped people repeatedly. And this is what Ezekiel says. And then like 3 verses later he says, but Yahweh says, I'm going to restore their fortunes. So the way that we interpret the text is important. And a lot of times what we've done is we've tried to get our theology so neatly packaged around a God who matches the God of Athanasius. Or if we're Catholic, the God of, who is it? The name is beyond me, but he's like, the books are like this. And everybody's got their favorite saint, and it's like, well, that's neat, but that's fan fiction. And fan fiction is fine. It's useful at times. Sometimes it helps you get to the heart of something. Jesus wrote fan fiction again. It's called parable. He didn't write it. He spoke it. That's fan fiction. That's a fiction on the story. And for Jesus, the story is all about a God who pursues his people. To the point of being unwilling to let them be lost. And that bears out throughout the whole Hebrew Bible. The flood story is a story of a God who pursues his people to a point that he is unwilling to let them be lost in the mire of violence that was happening. We may not like the means that Israel said he used, but the story is the same story. It's a God who pursues his people. And this is throughout. And it's wrapped into the little individual stories too, right? God boots them out of Eden. And it's like, we know the song, the Rich Mullins, oh, the Lord wasn't joking when he kicked him out of Eden. Boom! And we think like a God who's like in his mansion, and he's like, get out! And you go rolling down the stairs. And then the dogs, and he's like, release the hounds! And they come out to get us, and then they stand there with a flaming sword at the gate. No, that's not what happens in the story. What happens in the story is God goes boom and then comes out with them. And so this idea of exile, again, we don't like it. We don't like that Ezekiel says, I'm bringing the razor against you. This is God talking through Ezekiel. I'm bringing the razor of Babylon against you. I'm going to wipe you out. And we don't like it. And it's ugly. And we have to apologize for it. But the story is that this stuff happens, and they're living in exile, and they have nothing, and who's with them? God's with them. He's like, I have to exile you because you made me write laws, and since I wrote them, I'm bound by them. But, this is the story. This is I feel like I have to say this all the time. This isn't necessarily what I believe. This is what the story says. How you deal with the story is between you and God, and I'm never going to tell you anymore how to do that. I'm just giving you information. But the story is that exile happens because of disobedience, right? And then in that, though I make my own bed in Sheol, you're there with me. I've done what was required for me to be exiled. Oh, and you're here. And this is the story, right? And then it happens in its crescendo in the incarnation. And the people who are exiled, who are enemies and alienated from God in their minds, and some points, yes, that means just in your mind, but at other points it means like they were distant from God. However you frame the word distant. Okay, they felt far from him. He seemed like he wasn't there. There were no more prophets, but there were. They were just all crazy. Does John the Baptist seem very sane to many of you? No. Probably wouldn't leave him in a room alone with my kids. No. But then in the midst of all this, they're in exile, their temple has been destroyed, their babies have been murdered, their women have been raped. They find God in the midst of it, and they're still living in that when Rome comes. And so God says, okay, and he becomes an exile with them. I've been with you in your exile, but at this point now, okay, I'm going to be with you in your exile. And so this is what Jesus steps into. Okay, and however you want to frame the Jesus story, the story of the Bible is that God became a person. And that person was a male, so we say he. I don't need to get caught up in all that. And he endured exile. The wages of sin is no. That's you quoting Paul, not reading your Bible. The wages of sin, according to the Bible, is exile. The result of exile is death. Because you're living in a foreign land that's not your own, you have no protection, there may not be water or food, who knows if you can grow food there, if they'll even let you. The wages of sin is exile, and the result of exile is death, and Paul shortens that for us. He's like, hey, this is the end result. And the end result of the exile of Christ is death. And then the repayment of God to humanity for death is resurrection. And so this is why we're Christian, in those of us who are, is that this is the idea. That the God who was continually chasing his people down finally chased them down enough to become one of them. Like, hey, all I want to do is be one of you. Oh, you mean you want to be with us? No, I want to be you. Big difference. With is around. I want to be in the room with you, but I'm going to leave if you fart. No. It's, I want to experience what you're experiencing. And then is it any wonder that having to experience the garbage that life has to throw at us, Jesus stands and presents people as wholly blameless and above reproach. He's like, hey, it's actually not so easy. Not that God doesn't know that, right? But he's like, this isn't easy. It's hard, and I know it's hard. And I'm going to identify with you for all eternity at the throne of grace. This is what Paul says, right? It's this self-identification, but you can only identify by getting down into the muck with people. That's what incarnation is all about. It's getting into the muck. It's not a glorious virgin birth. It's a messy baby with afterbirth. And a placenta that had to come out after that. I've had 7 kids. I've gotten to see a lot of that. It's bloody and it's wet and the baby's slimy and they have white stuff on them. And Jesus probably came out looking like an alien. They all do. It's bright! And he pooped his diapers. And he grew, and he stunk, and he probably, my 11-year-old has bad BO right now. He's at that age where it's like hitting, and he's not quite figured out deodorant yet, and it's like, put some on, and I'm sure that there was a time where Mary was like, Jesus, go take a bath, you stink. And the good little obedient Jesus of Western Christianity said, yes, mother, and then walked on the water and lowered down in, But the real citizen of Judea, Jesus, probably was like, I don't want to. It happens. Kids tend to argue. And then he kept growing, and then they were at a store one day, and he wandered off at the store, and he got lost, and they lost him for 3 days. Can you imagine not knowing where your kid is in the ancient world? 2 days, 3 days, something like that? I'm an Old Testament guy. That's my excuse. I would be freaking out if I didn't know where one of my kids was. For 10 minutes, let alone 3 days. And where do they find him? The arrogant little punk is off telling the rabbis that they're wrong. Every 13-year-old I know. Okay? That's how I know the 13-year-old story of Jesus is legitimate. And this is, look, if we believe that Jesus is Lord, then that means that he gets to play that part too. Which means that everywhere we see Lord, even in the Hebrew Bible, we can talk about Jesus in our understanding. If Jesus is Lord, he's Lord of the whole Bible, and he's Lord of the Old Testament and the New. This doesn't mean that everything that is said about him is right in the Old or the New. Make sense? Sometimes what is being said about God is actually not even about God. I said this about Genesis 2, the creation story there, and the reason for there being a second creation narrative. You need hierarchy. So the second creation narrative sets up the hierarchy. A woman comes from man. Therefore, man is over her, in the sense of head of the home and things like that. But the first creation story doesn't say that. It says he created the Adam in the image of God. He created them male and female. That's it. And that's the end of the story. And then we go, yeah, but that's Adam and Eve. Nope. That's a being with, at best, dual natures. The Quran follows that narrative. They consider that to be the right one and the other one to be more of a creation. So, to use the word. Okay, so we have finished now with the first chapter of the patriarchal history. And we'll try and do a couple the next time to kind of cover some ground. But we're entering a time where the unknown has gone. Okay, we don't know what happened back then, is what Israel's saying. We know there was a flood. Here's our idea of why. And our idea of why comes from stories that are from our mixed tribes. Okay, and again, we see that. 2 creation narratives, 2 flood stories. Noah's told twice to gather animals. Once it's 2, another time it's 7. Different things that happen. So you can see, okay, these are multiple traditions being put together to tell a story, and that story is the pursuit of God of his people. Okay? And so now we're getting to the patriarchal history, and the patriarchal history is considered to be the known history. Okay, so Abraham really existed. If you say, did Adam exist? A lot of Jews are going to go, But if you say, did Abraham exist? They go, absolutely. Okay, and that's okay. We can say that too. Was Adam a being? Don't know. Was there a literal Adam and Eve? Don't know. And if you say, well, the Bible says, then you don't know either because it says multiple things. But now it's more comfortable, right? Because now we're out of the unknown. The unknown is terrifying, and that's why people are so scared of Genesis 1 to 11. There's a lot of fear and trembling that goes on in reading the Bible, and there doesn't need to be. I had a friend who rolled a joint out of one of the pages of the Bible one time, and God didn't strike him dead. He smoked the whole thing, and he's still alive. I don't think you should disrespect our sacred text that way, but it does go to show you that God's not hovering over every individual Bible waiting to strike dead people who read it wrong. I think what he's done is he's already spoken there. And a lot of times the way that he speaks looks really different than what we've been taught he's saying. We've been taught that God says, obey me or I'll flood the earth and kill you all. But what he's actually saying is, I don't want to do this. I don't need your sacrifices. I'm never going to do it again. I mean, those are 2 different visions of God. And we can always, always, always fall back, for those of us who are still uncomfortable, on the fact that pre-scientific people are not subject to scientific law. On the sense of, oh, well, they lied. No, they didn't. Well, they were wrong. Not necessarily. Well, that's not Jesus. I don't see his name there. Well, but it's this, that. Well, hold on. What the New Testament guys do with the Old Testament to tell the story of Jesus is another matter. Okay? They do what the Old Testament guys did with their tribal traditions. They pull from their traditions and they write the story of Jesus. This is why there are disagreements in the Synoptic Gospels. This is why John doesn't agree with any of them. This is why dating things are off in the New Testament, because that's not what they're doing. They're not trying to say, he's this and this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. They're saying, remember that story? He fulfilled it. And did Jesus change water into wine? Doesn't matter, because he did it in Cana. Cana is where they went in and wiped people out under Joshua. And Jesus is there having a party. Willingly. Well, did he actually turn water into wine? Don't know. But he partied in Cana, and he didn't kill anyone. So that speaks volumes about the character of the Jew, Jesus. And it also speaks volumes about the particular piece of land that gets called the Promised Land in the Bible, and how later people begin to treat that land. Okay? So it's a progression. It goes from don't really know to, yeah, we know, to, okay, we're absolutely certain, to, and this is the laws that are about our certainty, and here's all our group of people, and here's a second law, and then there's also this story about this guy named Joshua. Oh, and we had these judges at one time, and then they start to tell their history. Oh, and then we get Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, right? And all three of those are about the same time in history. Do yourself a favor and go read all 6 of those books as many times as you can in a row. And you'll start to notice all the discrepancies that are there. Chronicles says absolutely nothing negative about David. Nothing. David is the pinnacle, the image to be attained. But Kings and Samuel do. So what do we do? Okay, we'll get into those later. Okay, I think we're done. You're dismissed.